At night he slept and sometimes dreamed, but the shrine keeper did not come again. He did not call her. He carried what she had said like a stone in a sling, close, ready, but not thrown. He spent one long evening sitting with the chief priest, and the two of them said little. They shared water. The priest told him a story of a hunter who carried a trapped fire in a clay pot to warm his family. The pot cracked on the path, and the fire tried to run. The hunter could not catch it with his hands. He spread his body over it and let it burn through him, so it would die there and not in the grass. When the priest finished, he did not explain. Obioma understood. Queen Ifedi woke each night before dawn and walked the inner yard barefoot, the earth cool under her steps. She prayed with her feet and with her breath, asking the land to forgive her, asking the gods to turn their faces toward her son. She did not ask them to change the road. She only asked for mercy to walk it. The moon thinned and then fattened. The talk of an eclipse traveled like a rumor from hill to hill. Old men remembered when the sky had swallowed the sun before and the birds had gone silent at midday. Children asked questions that mothers did not answer. The day drew nearer when the drum would call the last dance, as the shrine keeper had said. In the last light of an evening close to that day, King Agumba stood with his son on the training ground. No one else was there. The king held two staves and handed one to Obioma. They began a slow dance of wood against wood, not to strike, but to learn the other's breath. The king's eyes shone with more than sweat. "I have been strong in many ways," he said at last. "This is the hardest way, to stand and not fight a thing I cannot strike, to love and not hold so tight that I break what I love, to guard a kingdom and a son with the same arms and not tear myself in two." Obioma lowered his staff. "I know," he said. "I am learning the same." They stood facing each other. The sun slipped and colored the yard with copper. The king stepped forward and pulled his son into his arms. It was not a warrior's embrace. It was the grip of a father who had carried a long season and knew another was arriving with longer legs. "Whatever you choose," the king said into his son's shoulder, "I will stand beside that choice. I am your father first, even while I am king. I will not leave you alone with a road I helped lay by not seeing what I should have seen." Obioma held him and nodded against his chest. "I will not run," he said. "When the drum calls, I will be ready to answer, even if my mouth shakes." The day closed its hand. The palace lamps were lit one by one, like stars that wanted to teach the sky how to last. In the huts beyond the wall, families ate quietly. In the market, a woman forgot to lower her voice before telling a story, and then remembered and fell silent. On the path to the river, two girls walked carrying empty pots and did not race as they usually did. The river kept its face calm, but even it seemed to listen, so the truth that had hidden for years stood upright in Ezenagu and refused to sit again. The palace, once full of songs, learned the music of low voices and careful steps. The king wrapped courage around his grief and kept watch. The queen wrapped mercy around her guilt and did the same. And Obioma, child of bargain and child of love, stood between them with eyes that saw too much and a heart that had already begun to choose the shape of its last hardest word. The days gathered speed like a river after heavy rain. The moon thinned and grew again. In compounds where people used to laugh in the cool of evening, voices fell and stayed low. Men sharpened hoes and found they could not lift them with the same spirit. Women stirred pots and forgot salt, then remembered and cried because forgetfulness had become common. Children asked, "Will the sun hide soon?" and were told to sleep early. No one slept early. The land, which had learned to hold its breath through many small sorrows, began to breathe with a hard chest. In the west field, cassava leaves bent downward and would not lift. In the goat pens, at the edge of the town, mothers gave milk that soured by nightfall. A fisherman fisherman at the river bend pulled up an empty net and said the water sounded wrong against the net's cord. When he said it a second time, he wept without sound, and his wife put her arm around him in a way that said she understood the kind of grief that has no voice. In the palace, the fast continued. The chief priest woke before any cock crowed and walked the inner yard in slow circles, whispering prayers that asked for nothing and gave everything he had. The old drummer sat under a fig's shade and tapped 2 slow heartbeats and a third that did not come. The third was the one he saved for courage. He saved it because the house needed it later. The praise singers kept their drums wrapped, but they sat together and breathed in time, each imagining the sound the drums would make if the land was saved. Imagining can be a prayer when words are tired. King Agumba moved like a pillar that had learned to walk. He sent yam to empty storehouses and palm oil to dry hands. He called the age grade to clear the paths to the river and to the sacred hill, not with noise, but with careful steps and strong backs. He spoke in the judgment hall with a voice that did not shake even when men came with disputes, born only from fear. Not today, he told quarrels, and the quarrels sat down in shame and waited for another day. He sent quiet guards to the hills to watch for strange flames. Fire was a rumor at first, then it became a line of orange breath on a far slope that burned the grasses and then slept as if the hill itself was practicing to speak. Queen Ifedi gave more than she had. She took beads from her arms and gave them to women who had sold theirs for grain. She sent cloth to mothers who had wrapped their babies in old wrappers, thinned by many washings. She went to the palace kitchen and cooked with her own hands, so the food would carry her breath. She did not speak the name of the road she feared, but each gift was a small way of asking the land to forgive her. At night, she knelt on mats that had never seen a queen kneel and pressed her forehead to the earth. She did not bargain. She said, "Mercy," until the word became softer than sleep. Obioma watched everything as a man watches the first cloud that means rain and also danger. He trained without pride. He held the staff in his hands the way one holds a friend. He stood in the judgment hall behind his father and counted how many times a liar's eyes blink before the lie comes. He walked to the fig tree in the evening and touched its trunk with an open palm, feeling the sap inside, feeling its patience. When he returned to his room, he folded leaf cups slowly, one by one, as the girl had taught him in years past. He kept them on his table as if he could sip courage from their green mouths when courage ran thin. He began to say quiet goodbyes without naming them. He visited the old drummer and listened until the man fell asleep in the middle of a story. He covered the old hands with a cloth and left silently. He stopped at the stable and fed a horse with eyes like wet clay. The horse breathed on his palm and snorted, and he laughed because the sound made the room feel simple. He went to the women's courtyard and greeted the oldest midwife, the one whose hands had brought him into the world. She touched his face with 3 fingers and drew a line across his brow. "I remember your first breath," she said. "I will remember your last." He kissed her hand and said nothing. The day before the eclipse, the sky was too clear. It carried a shine that felt like a blade. People worked with quick hands and short words. The elders walked the town and told men to put pots of water at the corners of their compounds, because water placed with intention can become a prayer that waits and does not sleep. The chief priest drew chalk marks at the palace gate and along the path to the sacred hill. "Not to keep anything out," he said when a guard asked. "To keep our hearts in one place when fear tries to pull them apart." In the afternoon, the first true fire showed itself without shame. It rose on the low hill beyond the wrestling ground, a red tongue licking up a dry patch of grass that no one had imagined could catch so fast. Men ran with leaves and beat the edges, shouting to the fire as if it could hear and change its mind. The fire listened, but only to its own hunger. It climbed, it paused, it lay down, it rose. Like a wild beast that had discovered its name, a wind came and carried a warm hand across faces that had known only cool breezes from that hill. The men beat until the fire slept. They looked at one another with eyes that had learned something they did not want to learn. By sunset, a thin smoke lay across Ezenagu like a veil. It had no smell yet. It was only a color. Still, color can be a warning the way a drumbeat can be a warning. Mothers drew water and set it near doorways. Fathers stacked sand by the gate. Children who would have played with small goats sat instead and plucked dry grass into a neat pile and then let the wind take it over and over as if practice could teach the hand to let go. The palace waited for night with a tight jaw. King Agumba walked to the royal temple and stood, not kneeling this time but tall, because sometimes the body must tell the spirit what it intends. He said the names of his fathers. He said the name of the land with the softness one uses for a sleeping child. He said his son's name last and let it sit in the air without crowding it. Then he turned and walked out to the courtyard where a small circle of elders stood. "We will guard the hill," he said simply. "We will guide the road. We will not let fear run before the prince. We will also not tie his feet if his heart has stepped already." No one answered. There are moments in a house when words bruise, even if they are true. Queen Ifedi waited at the door of Obioma's room. When he came, she did not ask him to sit, because sitting can make a person think they can avoid a road. She stood with him. She held his hand the way she had held it when he took his first steps, guiding his balance with a touch rather than a pull. "If there is anything left to say it to me now," she told him. "Do not carry it alone." He looked at her, and the ember of his eyes seemed to hold a deeper light than the lamp. "I do not have many words," he said. "I only have a promise. If there is a way to save the land and keep my life, I will find it. If there is not, I will not let the land die slowly while I watch my mother's heart break." She pressed her lips together until color left them. "I have wished to keep you," she said. "I have also wished to undo what I did. Those wishes cannot live in the same house. If you go, I will walk behind you. My feet will not stop you, but my breath will cover you." He bent his head, and she kissed his hair, as she used to when he was small and smelled of sleep and milk. For a moment, both remembered a courtyard with no smoke and a world that did not yet ask for blood. Night came with hot steps. The wind changed its mind and blew from the hills inward. The smell of smoke entered the palace and folded itself into the mats and clay. The guards at the gate spoke to each other in breaths, not words. The chief priest drew the last chalk mark and sat on the threshold like a stone that had chosen its place. The old drummer came and, without a drum, tapped the courage beat he had saved. The third beat came, and it did not crack. Then the hills woke. A line of fire walked across the ridge to the east, then another to the north. Not big, not yet a monster, but quick and sure. People poured from huts carrying small pots, leaves, calabashes of water. Answers rose on every side, some wise, some wild. A boy ran toward a flame with only his hands. A woman pulled him back and held him as if he were a goat that would jump the wrong fence. The sky, which had been clear, became a low ceiling of flicker. Shadows were born and died on faces too fast to follow. In the judgment yard, King Agumba called, not with a shout, but with a voice that sliced clean. Men gathered. The age grade stood with eyes bright and dark together. "We do not abandon our homes," the king said. "We do not run into flame. We do not panic. We will make lines to carry water. We will stamp small fires before they become big ones. We will keep the road to the hill open," he pointed with his staff, and men moved as if the staff itself had pulled them. He did not say, "We are ready for a sacrifice." He did not need to. The word hung everywhere like smoke. Obioma stepped into the yard without armor, without ornament. He wore a simple cloth tied well. He held no staff. His hands were empty and steady. The elders saw him and made a space without speaking. The queen came to his left. The king came to his right. The three stood as they had stood only once before, on the day of his naming. Only now the wind tasted of ash and not palm wine. Son, the king said, turning to face him fully, the land is breaking. If there is a road that saves both you and the land, I have not found it. I have searched with eyes in my head and eyes in my heart. I am ready to walk whatever road you choose, whether to the hill or to a hiding place, though I believe hiding offends the truth. There is no hiding, Obioma answered. A rope tied to the sky follows a man whether he runs or sits. The hill is the one place where roads meet the gods. Queen Ifedi took his hand. I will follow behind you, she said again, but now it was not a wish, it was a bond. If my feet fail, I will crawl. The old drummer lifted his head and tapped 3 beats on his knee. Somewhere far, a small fire coughed and lay down. The chief priest stood. I will walk ahead, he said, to speak the clean prayers that keep a path clear. They began to move. The palace watched, then followed, not in a swarm, but in an order that said this was not a chase, not a hunt, but a procession. Guards went to the sides, not to trap, but to keep space. Women who had water at the corners of their compounds lifted the pots and carried them, because water that waits can also walk. Children were taken inside. Old women came to doorways and pressed hands to lips so their cries would not run out and trip the feet of the ones who must walk. The path to the sacred hill had been cleared earlier by men who believed in preparing for what their hearts denied. The chalk marks glowed pale under the small fire's light. Ash fell like grey rain. The night animals had gone still. Even the frogs hid their voices. At the foot of the hill, where a low shrine stone marked the start of the climb, the chief priest raised his hand and spoke words that named the land, the sky, the river, the first mother, the first father, the stool, the breath. He did not mention bargains. He did not mention the forbidden. He named only what was clean, and the clean things answered by being themselves. Obioma looked up. The hill was not high, but it held itself like a king who did not need height to be obeyed. The grass shivered with a wind that did not touch the trees below. A thin line of flame ran like a snake across a far shoulder of the hill, and then fell asleep. The moon wore a color that was not its own, a shadow already tasting its edge. Wait, King Agamba said softly, and put both hands on his son's shoulders. He looked into the ember eyes and saw his own face reflected as a younger man, full of victories and simple beliefs. He saw the face of his wife as a girl who had laughed under a palm in a season before crowns. He saw the stool sitting empty for a breath that felt like a lifetime. He did not cry. He held his son and made his back remember the shape of love. Then he let go. Queen Ifedi took her turn, but she did not hold his shoulders. She took his hands and turned his palms up, studying the lines the way a mother studies the face of a child about to sleep. She kissed each palm, left and right, as if kissing the places that would not hold a spear, would not hold anything once they were open to the gods. My son, she said, and the word traveled into the ground. My son, she could say nothing else. The chief priest stepped forward and tied a thin white cloth at Obioma's waist, not to bind him, but to show the road who was coming. He drew a simple sign with chalk on the prince's brow. Breath, he said. He drew the same on the queen and the king. Breath, he repeated. Breath for the land, breath for the house, breath for the one who carries rope. A wind rose. It pulled the hair on their arms into a small dance. From the town came a low sound, neither chant nor wail, but the sound a house makes when every heart inside it breathes together, afraid and brave at the same time. The first thin bite of the eclipse touched the moon, and the light on the hill changed shape, the way a face changes when a thought enters it. Obioma set his foot on the first stone. It did not slip. He set his foot on the second. His breath kept time with his steps. Behind him, the queen began to climb, one hand on the rock, one on the white cloth at his waist, though she did not grip it. The king climbed beside them, his body a wall against any fear that might learn to walk. The chief priest went ahead, speaking the simple words in a voice as even as a steady flame. Guards fanned out, not to forbid new feet, but to keep the path clear for those who needed it. Below, the palace looked smaller with each step. The river was a dark line. The fields were nets laid over sleeping earth. The fires on the other hills woke and slept, as if practicing for the larger breath to come. The sky, taking the shadow into itself, dimmed by a small, careful degree. Halfway up, Obioma stopped. He looked back and saw the people gathered at the foot, faces tilted up, hands pressed to chests. He lifted one hand in a gesture that could have been greeting, could have been blessing. The gesture moved through the crowd like a wind. People did not clap or shout. They lowered their heads and let a tear fall into the dust, and the tears did not scorch the ground. The ground drank them and grew quiet. They climbed again. The rocks grew warm under their feet, as if a hidden fire lay inside the hill, waiting for a question it did not want to answer. The chief priest's voice thinned and then thickened as the wind played with it. A bird rose in sudden flight from a low bush and vanished into the dimming light. At the final bend, where the path straightened and the top was near, the shrine keeper's presence moved like cool water. No body formed, only a certainty. The gods were listening. The road was ready. Obioma stopped again and faced his parents. If the gods want a willing heart, he said, they have it. If they want a steady body, it is here. If they want fear, I have it too, but I will carry it so it does not spill. King Agumba steadied his voice with a breath trained over many years. My son, I stand with you. He looked at the hilltop and for the first time in a long life, wished he were only a father and not a king. He remained both. Queen Ifedi rested her forehead against her son's chest for a short, stolen moment. My son, forgive me again, she whispered, because forgiveness must be asked at the gate and at the gate again. He laid his hand on her head, not as a priest, not as a king, but as a child who understood the size of a mother's mistake and the size of her love. He said nothing. The blessing traveled anyway. They turned and took the last steps. The top of the hill opened like a palm. A flat stone lay at its center, old as the first story told by the first grandmother. The air felt thin, like the high note of a flute held longer than any man thought possible. Between the hills, a deep orange waked and slept, and the face of the sky darkened more, tasting the shadow that would soon swallow it whole. Ezenagu held its breath. The palace held its breath. The fig tree held its breath. The river, the goats, the ground itself, they all waited at the lip of a choice. The drum in the old drummer's head tapped 3 simple beats and stopped, not because there was no more courage, but because courage had arrived at the place where it takes a shape and becomes a deed. Obioma stepped toward the stone. His mother's fingers brushed the white cloth at his waist and then fell away. His father's shadow crossed his feet and then moved aside. The chief priest's voice dropped to a whisper that felt like a hand smoothed over a child's hair. The shrine keeper's unseen gaze lifted. The sky, swallowing the moon's light in a slow bite, dimmed the hill until even fire wore a murmur. The moment opened, full and heavy. And in that opening, with the kingdom poised between burning and breath, Obioma drew in air, set his jaw, and moved to stand where the gods could hear him most. The hill held a thin wind that did not know whether to be cold or warm. The light kept changing as the shadow moved across the sky, like a hand covering and uncovering a lamp. Obioma stood on the flat stone, and the breath inside him felt like a drum, trained by the chief drummer himself. He lifted his eyes to the sky and then lowered them to the land that had named him, the land that had suffered with him, the land that waited for his mouth. Behind him, Queen Ifedi stood with her hands clasped so tightly the beads bit her skin. King Agumba stood like a tree that had learned to bend without breaking. The chief priest stood near the edge of the stone, his lips moving with the old clean words that did not bargain. Below, the people of Ezenagu waited in a wide ring at the foot of the hill, their faces turned upward, their hearts beating as if they shared one chest. The old drummer sat on a rock and kept time with his fingers on his knee, though no one could hear it but him. The fires on the far hills woke and slept, growing bolder with each breath of wind. Obioma spread his hands and felt the air settle on his palms. He spoke, and his voice did not have to be loud. The hill heard it, the sky heard it, the land heard it, because the land already knew his breath. Spirits who kept our fathers, he said steady. Gods who hold the rope between the earth and the sky, ancestors whose footprints we still find in the dust. Hear me, I am Obioma, son of King Agumba and Queen Ifedi. I was born by a bargain I did not choose, but I have lived by a love I did not earn. The land's breath is tied to mine. Today, I cut the rope with my own hand, not with iron, with willing heart. The shadow moved further across the face of the moon. The world grew dim in a way that made colors go quiet. Even the flames on the nearest hill seemed to listen. Queen Ifedi stepped forward, then stopped, her body torn between a mother's pull and a queen's obedience. King Agumba closed his eyes once and opened them, placing himself in the hard place where he was both father and king and could not be one without the other. Obioma turned to them. Mother, he said, you gave me life. You also gave me a rope to carry. I have carried it. I forgive you. Keep living. Tell the children who will be born after me that love is a strong river, but it must not break its banks. Queen Ifedi's knees bent as if they could no longer remember their work. She held herself with the last strength in her body. My son, she whispered, my son. The two words left her and hung in the air like a cloth that would never fall. Obioma faced the king. Father, you taught me to plant my feet and hold my breath steady. You taught me to judge with a clean mind. You taught me that a stool cannot be kept by fear. Keep the stool with courage and kindness. Keep the land safe from men who look for hidden doors when patience is the open road. King Agumba placed his hand on Obioma's head. His palm was warm, firm, and careful. My son, he said, you stand taller than any king I have known. If there is a road after this, I will find it by the light you leave behind. If there is only memory, I will make it a law in this house. He withdrew his hand slowly, like a man leaving his mark on wet clay. The chief priest looked to the sky and then to the stone. The moment is a mouth, he said, voice thin but unbroken. Speak into it. Obioma turned to the land again. He drew in breath, deep and slow. Old fear rose and tried to climb his throat. He held it gently and pressed it down, the way a mother presses a fever back with a cool cloth. He gathered courage like a cloth, folded it once, folded it twice, and placed it inside his chest. He thought of the girl who had taught him to fold leaf cups, of the old drummer's three-beat courage, of the fig tree that had always kept its green face in every season, of the river's clear laughter, of small boys wrestling in dust, of women greeting the morning at the well with songs. He thought of the day he had learned that seeing is heavier when it looks behind faces. He thought of the bargain and refused to let it be the last words. He made love the last word. He lifted his face to the dim sky and opened his mouth. The cry that came was not loud and not long. It began like the first call of a rooster at dawn and ended like the quiet closure of a door. It carried no anger. It carried no blame. It carried resolve, clean and bright. It was a cry that had been waiting since the first day the land withered at his first breath. The world answered. On the nearest hill, the sleeping fire shuddered, rose in a tall tongue, and then folded like a mat being rolled by an unseen hand. On the next ridge, flames that had begun to crawl turned their faces down and lay still, as if a mother had placed a palm on a stubborn child's head and said, "Enough." The dry wind that had traveled from slope to slope lost its anger and fell to the ground like a tired animal. Smoke that had hung low lifted and thinned, then drifted away in long, pale fingers. In the fields, cassava leaves straightened. In the goat pens, milk settled into sweetness. In the fishermen's nets, the cords sang the old good sound against the water. The river, which had learned to darken at sorrow, shone in the half-light, holding the sky's strange face as calmly as if it were an ordinary morning. At the palace garden, the fig tree gave a sigh. No one heard it with ears, but every leaf understood it. On the stone, light began to grow from the center of Obioma's chest. At first, it was only a softness, like the fading edge of day on a clay wall. Then it brightened until it was like a lamp with clean oil. Then it became more than a lamp. It became the kind of light that washes corners and teaches shadows to be humble. The white cloth at his waist glowed. His hands glowed. His eyes, which had always held embers, opened and poured out a steady, warm fire that did not burn. Queen Ifedi cried out, not from sorrow alone, but from wonder that broke her and made her whole at the same time. She reached forward and stopped herself. King Agumba did not move, but his whole body bowed without bending. The way a man bows inside himself when he stands before something he cannot conquer and does not wish to. The chief priest fell to his knees and put his forehead to the stone. The old drummer on the low rock felt his fingers stop. For the first time in many years, he wept like a young man, water running down a face where time had already cut deep marks. At the foot of the hill, the people dropped to the earth and held it as if it would run away. The light did not rush. It deepened. It gathered. It seemed to listen for a permission that came from a place no one could name. Then it rose, not up and away, but up and through. It traveled through Obioma's skin, as if skin were only a curtain moved by gentle hands. His shape remained, but it was full of brightness. He lifted his hands slightly, palms open, as if offering the world back to itself. Breath, he said one last time, and the word was not sound anymore. It was a movement, a wave traveling out across fields and huts, across goats and rivers, across the palace and the market, across the small shrine stones at compound corners. Wherever it passed, a secret tightness let go. The light reached a point that a human eye could not bear. Queen Ifedi, who would have watched even if her eyes turned to ash, closed them at last, because love sometimes learns to trust without looking. King Agumba's eyes filled and did not spill. The chief priest, still kneeling, whispered, "Let it be counted." The light pulled tight like a drawn bowstring and then released. There was no sound of breaking, no thunder, no tearing. There was only a sudden returning of the world to itself, the way a calabash steadies when the water inside settles. The shadow on the moon moved on. The sky opened its face again. The hill's wind chose to be cool and stayed that way. The fire on the far ridge lay out flat and then died into a quiet line of ash. On the stone, the light thinned and went, and with it, the body that had held it. Where Obioma had stood was emptiness, shaped like peace. A single white bead, fallen from Queen Ifedi's wrist at some point she would never remember, lay shining on the stone. The chalk mark on the stone's surface, drawn earlier by the chief priest's finger, remained. The rope that had tied the prince's breath to the land was gone. Everyone knew it, not by sight, but by the way their chests filled and emptied, as if the world had agreed again to share air with them. Queen Ifedi's legs gave way and she sat on the stone, not caring whether queens should sit on sacred places. She gathered the empty air where her son had been and held it to her as if it were a child she could still warm. She did not wail. A deep, steady sound came from her, almost like a hum, and it carried both sorrow and a kind of pride that is not proud. King Agumba knelt beside her with a slow movement that looked like the bending of a tree in a gentle rain. He placed his arm around her shoulders. For a long time they did nothing but breathe. The chief priest rose and stood very straight, older by many seasons and younger by one. He lifted both hands toward the sky and said, "It is finished." The words did not feel borrowed. They felt earned. At the foot of the hill, the people saw the light's end and waited for a sign that would tell them how to mourn. A bird flew overhead, not a hawk this time, but a small brown bird with quick wings. It circled once and then twice and then made a short, high song. The old drummer stood and answered it with 3 soft taps on his knee. All through the crowd, people bowed their heads. Some wept quietly, some smiled through tears, some touched the earth and then touched their foreheads. The children, who understood more than adults ever believed, held each other's hands and looked up with serious faces. The climb down was slow. The king and queen did not rush. They left nothing on the stone but the bead. The chief priest gathered the bead and pressed it into Queen Ifedi's palm. "Keep it," he said, "not as a wound, as a promise." She nodded and closed her fingers over it like a seed. By the time they reached the foot of the hill, the air smelled of cooling ashes instead of open fire. The people parted to make a path. No one cried out the names of the king and queen. They walked in a hush that honored more than crowns. Women came forward with water and held the calabashes out with both hands. Queen Ifedi drank and passed the bowl to the king, and he drank and passed it to the chief priest, and he drank and poured the last mouthful on the ground. The elders stepped forward with slow steps and bent, each touching their foreheads to the earth before the king and queen, not to the stool, to the 2 who had lost and given at the same time. The oldest among them spoke. "The land has returned to breath," he said, "but it will not forget what it cost. We will not allow it to forget, because forgetting is the first wrong door." King Agumba's voice came back to him in pieces and then whole. "We will mark this hill," he said. "We will set a stone by the stone and tell our children that on this place a prince chose his people over his years. We will teach them to fear the shrines with smoke-polished walls and to love the temples with clean altars. We will teach them to wait for the high gods with patience." The people answered with silence that felt like thunder held in an open hand. Then, as if one thought had passed through 1,000 minds, they began to sing low. It was not a festal song. It was not a funeral song. It was the kind of song that can be carried on a walk, the kind that makes feet strong and keeps a house standing while it repairs its roof. The melody moved like water in the mouth of a pot and filled the air with a soft strength. Days after, the land proved itself healed by small signs and large. In the morning light, drops clung to cassava leaves like beads. Goats crowded the pen gates with the early hunger that means everything is right. The river laughed around stones where it used to sulk. Fishermen returned with nets carrying a respectable weight. In the market, women started to forget to whisper and had to be reminded to lower their voices for the first time since fear had settled in the square. The fig tree at the palace sent out a fresh spray of leaves that looked like new words written on an old page. The palace did not return to the old noise. It learned a quieter joy. Drums came back slowly, one skin at a time, one beat at a time. The old drummer taught the children 2 rhythms, one for gratitude, one for warning. He made them promise to listen to both with equal respect. The praise singers crafted a new chant that named King Agumba's steady rule, Queen Ifedi's brave sorrow, and Obioma's willing light. They sang it without boasting, and the people sang it back without pride. When they came to Obioma's name, the crowd pressed hands to chests. Queen Ifedi moved through the palace like a lamp with a steady flame. She wept when she needed to, and she did not hide it. She laughed when laughter came, and she did not feel guilty. She kept the white bead near her heart, touching it when sleep would not settle. In the women's courtyard, she sat with new mothers and held their babies without trembling. She told them old stories, and the one new story that must never be told wrongly. Our house almost went to a wrong door, she said, and love paid the price. She did not say her own name. She did not need to. The women knew. They loved her with a love that had learned to look straight at pain. King Agumba governed with a deeper slow. He did not rush judgments. He did not raise his voice unless the house truly needed the sound. He added to the laws of Ezenagu a simple line. No one would seek forbidden bargains for private gain, whether out of fear or out of impatience. He sent word to distant hamlets, telling them the story in clean lines so rumor would not make a nest where truth should sleep. He placed 3 stones at the foot of the sacred hill with 3 carvings, a rope, a flame, and a leaf. Beneath them, 4 words: breath is a gift. Once a moon, the people walked to the hill in calm procession. They carried water. They sang the walking song. At the top, the chief priest spoke only the clean names, and no other mouth was allowed to speak there. They left offerings that were not dangerous, kola broken and shared, clean water poured, silence held for a count that children could learn. When they came down, they greeted the land with hands on leaves and hands on clay walls. Children grew who had never seen the sky swallow the moon. They ran through the palace courtyard and wrestled in the dust. Sometimes when they fell and cried, their mothers' hands flew to their mouths from old habit, then came down slowly when they saw that leaves did not curl and water did not darken. They taught their children to hold tears like precious water, not because tears would harm the land, but because tears are powerful and should be spent with truth. When strangers asked about the hill, the people of Ezenagu answered with good measure. They said a prince had stood there and turned his life into light because a rope tied to him had begun to choke the land. They said his name and pressed their hands to their breasts. They did not tell the story with fear. They told it with respect. They did not make a god out of a boy. They made a law out of his choice. One evening, years later, when Hamatan dust lay like a pale veil on thatched roofs and the air was sweet with the smell of firewood, Queen Ifedi walked to the fig tree at the palace edge. She placed her hand on its trunk and closed her eyes. "My son," she said softly into the bark, "the land is breathing. I am breathing. Your father is breathing. The house is breathing. We remember." A small wind answered her and shook the newest leaves like children, laughing quietly. King Agumba came to stand beside her. He had grown more silver in his beard. Time had carved his face, but had not dimmed his gaze. He touched the same bark and said nothing for a long while. Then he spoke one line only. "We kept the stool, and we did not forget the price." They stood together as the sun softened, and the palace lamps were lit one by one, as if the world were practicing again the lesson of that day, how a single light can become many lights without becoming less. In the quiet that followed, the drums began, not for war, not for celebration, but for memory. 3 slow beats, a pause, 3 slow beats, a pause, the rhythm of breath. It moved through the courtyards, into the market, along the river path, across the fields. It traveled to the hill and touched the stone where a white bead had once lain. It reminded the land and the people of what had been paid and what had been saved. Thus Ezenagu lived, not with forgetfulness, but with a careful remembering that made joy honest and sorrow useful. The story of Obioma, the prince with ember eyes who carried a rope he did not tie and cut it with his own will, became a path for the young to walk when they faced hard choices. The elders pointed to the hill when they gave counsel. Mothers told the tale at night with lamps low and hands warm on small backs. Fathers taught their sons to plant their feet and to keep their hearts clean. The chief priest taught children short prayers that named only what was true. The old drummer, before his hands finally rested, taught a last group of boys and girls the rhythm that holds a house steady. No one called Obioma a curse anymore. They called him a savior, but even that word they spoke softly, as if his name was still light and might rise if shouted. In the cool before dawn, when a thin mist lay near the ground, some swore they could see the shape of a young man on the hilltop standing still, palms open, eyes gentle, watching the land breathe. Whether that was truth or wish, the land did not argue. It had learned with the people to honor a quiet miracle. In time, when visitors came and asked how a kingdom so old still held together with so few scars, the elders gave the same answer. Our people fear wrong doors. We honor right love. And we remember a boy who turned his life into light so that the rest of us could keep our breath. Then they would lead the visitors to the 3 stones at the hill's foot and have them read the 4 words carved deep enough that even rain could not wear them away. Breath is a gift. The story teaches that love without patience and wisdom can open wrong doors, and every shortcut, every forbidden bargain demands a price that others may have to pay. True leadership faces truth, carries responsibility, and protects the many over the one. Obioma shows that a person is not defined by the curse tied to them, but by the choices they make. He turns fear into courage and pain into mercy, giving himself to save his people. Ezenagu learns to wait on clean paths, to honor honest love, to guard hearts from desperate decisions, and to remember always that breath is a gift. Thank you so much for watching. Your love and support mean everything to me. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones to spread the inspiration. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more interesting African stories. See you in the next video. Bye.